This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a program brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust. I'm Dougal Stevenson. In this program, Bill Southworth looks at how the news that World War I was over was received in Dunedin. Gregor Campbell tells us how a railways guard was shocked to his core. And Alison Breeze updates us on some new listings by Heritage New Zealand. Late in 1918, the agony of the First World War was nearing an end. Young men from Otago had flocked to the Empire's cause, but the bones of many of them now lay in Europe. Bill Southworth has been looking at the reaction in Dunedin to the news that the war was finally over.
There had been more than 4 long years of war when the guns fell silent in 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At that time, the population in New Zealand was less than 1.25 million. About 10% of the total population had served overseas. 18,000 had died. That's right, 18,000, either killed in action or dying of wounds and disease. A proportion of the population that in today's terms would equate to 90,000 young men having died. Dunedin had lost hundreds of them in places like Gallipoli, Passchendaele and the Somme. News reached New Zealand on November the 8th that Germany had signed a preliminary armistice. In Dunedin, the largest crowds the city had ever seen gathered spontaneously on the streets. People danced, bands played, and amateur musicians abounded. People banged kerosene tins, pots, pans, and anything that could come to hand, creating a joyful din. There were marching units made up of men from the hillside workshops, the tramways, and a large contingent of both men and women from the Roslyn woolen mills. As the Evening Star reported,
a noticeable feature of the day's jubilations was almost the entire absence of drunkenness. No artificial stimulant was needed to send the spirits of the crowd up to fever heat.
All invalided soldiers that could stand left hospital wards and headed for the streets, where they were received with a great reception. That evening they were the guests for dinners put on by the proprietors of the Criterion and provincial hotels. News was received that Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated and fled to sanctuary in the Netherlands. Soldiers and sailors in Germany had mutinied and were flying red flags from their warships and military barracks. 5 days later, on November the 13th at 8:54 in the morning, the Prime Minister gave Dunedin's mayor the news that Germany had formally surrendered. 1 minute later, the big bells at the cathedral were ringing out, and crowds again started gathering. The mayor addressed them, urging them to make a holiday of it. An hour later, a dense crowd filled Princes Street, from the Octagon to the old post office, and the first of processions commenced, and there was a constant detonation of bangs and crackers, which made a tremendous din. That night, a packed St. Paul's Cathedral was told by Bishop Neville
they had come to thank God for hearing their prayers. It was a day for a peace such as would not be broken for many long years, a peace which was complete and which represented a victory over our enemies such as harboured no shadow of doubt. Victory to the Empire and the Allies was granted for the overthrow of wickedness and the punishment of those who did evil. Though war drums would be laid aside forever, and war would be no more, for surely empires so united and banded together would, in integrity and truth, never permit such a breach to occur again.
At an also packed Knox Church, the Reverend R.E. Davis told the congregation,
our eyes were not accustomed to the light as yet, and it would take some time to adapt ourselves to the new conditions which obtained after the war. We did not exult in the triumph over our enemies, but rejoiced that right and justice and freedom proved superior to wrong and oppression.
The same edition of the Otago Daily Times that reported these sermons also carried the news that 23-year-old Eric Andrew Miller of Kapuna, Southland, the only son of Andrew and Isabel Miller, had died in action in France. In another sermon at First Church by the Reverend Professor Hewitson, it was reported,
The speaker mentioned 3 grounds for thankfulness, namely the cessation of the horrors of war, the victory for government by the people, for the people, and of the people, and the service and sacrifice leaders and people, men and women, which had achieved these results.
But most historians agree that Eric Miller and the 18,000 Kiwis who died in the war did not die for freedom or democracy. Comforting as the reasons given by the Reverend gentleman may have been, the historians see the real cause of the war as being a series of isms, namely nationalism, imperialism and militarism, locked together by a series of military alliances which triggered a disastrous war. The desire for adventure and loyalty to the empire did the rest. According to the newspapers, Earl Grey had just died.
It was said his dying utterances were to confirm the statement of a friend that no beauty in all this wide world would compare in his eyes with the beauty of the British Empire. It was to him the magic beauty of the world.
Thoughts in Dunedin soon turned to what to do with the wounded and maimed from the war. The Monticello Veterans Home and Hospital was set up to care for wounded soldiers. Opened in 1918, it was originally a Red Cross convalescent military home before being renamed. At Dunedin Hospital, a new 60-bed ward was built specifically for returning servicemen. The Caversham Infirmary was also expanded to cope with returning and wounded soldiers. The following year, a workshop in Crawford Street was set up for disabled servicemen who could no longer do heavy physical work. They were taught trades such as bookbinding, carpentry and upholstering. They were paid fair wages without the pressure of competing in the open market. The trials for Dunedinites were not over. The same month the war ended, the disastrous Spanish flu epidemic reached Dunedin. Just before the armistice was announced, public inhalation chamber had to be set up in the old post office building on the corner of Water and Bond Streets. Within a fortnight of the flu's arrival, the Otago Daily Times was reporting,
The number of cases of influenza in the hospital were increased by 6 yesterday, and 3 of the patients died. Over 80 patients suffering from influenza are still in the hospital, including a large number of nurses. The hospital authorities say that they'll be able to manage to find accommodation for a day or 2 yet.
Brought back from Europe by the returning soldiers, the Spanish flu would cause 223 deaths in the city and over 9,000 nationwide. This is Bill Southworth reporting.
In April of 1908, the New Zealand Truth had something meaty to chew on. A supposedly respectable businessman was in court for committing a grossly indecent act. The eminent journal might have found itself in a minor dilemma, how to report it fully, but not too fully, for they were definitely going to report it. This report from Gregor Campbell.
In April of 1908, the New Zealand Truth had something meaty to chew on. A supposedly respectable businessman was in court for committing a grossly indecent act. The eminent journal might have found itself in a minor dilemma, how to report it fully, but not too fully, for they were definitely going to report it. A merchant in a mess. John Batker's bad behaviour. What happened in the Express? Intense respectability saves a sexual sinner. Somewhat of a sensation was caused in the South Island by the appearance in the Christchurch Magistrates Court on Wednesday of John Batker, frozen meat and produce merchant of Invercargill, on a charge of committing a grossly indecent act in a carriage on the Dunedin and Christchurch Express on March 10. Batker is a keen-faced, middle-aged individual who usually stops at Warner's aristocratic pub when in Christchurch. He pleaded not guilty through lawyer Donnelly. The prosecution was based mainly on the evidence of guard Frank Vernazzoni, who passed through the birdcage occupied by Batka and the young woman when the train was near Glenavy. He discovered the couple in such a position as to leave no doubt in his mind that a grossly indecent act was being committed by both. He remarked to Batka that if he was going to commit an indecent act, he might at least draw the curtains. Batka replied, "It's all right, old man," and reaching behind him displayed his tourist ticket. The guard afterwards returned and asked for the ticket to ascertain the name of the traveller, but Batka refused to show it. He also refused to give the name of the lady and offered the guard a whisky. That functionary was not to be bribed and threatened to report the libertine, who said, "You'll get yourself into trouble as well as me." George Walker, newsagent, joined the train at Palmerston South. He was passing through the train near Shag Point Junction and looked through the window of the birdcage and saw something that shocked him, something terrible. On returning later, he witnessed more, and the conduct of Batka and the lady scandalised him. Lawyer Donnelly cross-questioned him severely, and witness said he couldn't swear as to what they were actually doing. Counsel for the defence claimed that the evidence of Walker related to an act separate and distinct from that testified to by the guard, and couldn't be heard in support of the charge. Sergeant Johnston contended that the offence was a continuous one. Mr. Donnelly urged that where alleged offences were committed within 100 miles of each other, they should be the subject of two different charges, and evidence pertaining to one couldn't be given in support of the other. The point was important, as the guard's evidence would thus be uncorroborated. Counsel quoted law on the subject and mentioned the case of Hall of Timaru, when the prisoner was charged with the murder of his father-in-law. The court then admitted evidence that Hall had formerly given poison to his wife, but the Court of Appeal subsequently held that such testimony was inadmissible, and Hall was sentenced to imprisonment for life. Hargreaves and Peter Pender, JP, decided to hear the whole of the facts, however. For the defence, Donnelly represented that Batka was an eminently respectable merchant from prohibited Invercargill, where he had a wife and family. He called an ex-bank manager of Invercargill, now in Christchurch, as to his character. Batka had a son attending Christ College. A Christchurch grain merchant also testified to Batka's intense respectability. John Batka, giving evidence in his own defence, said he had known the young lady ever since she was a small child and met her on the Palmerston platform. He had been travelling in a first-class smoker and joined the girl in the birdcage. They were talking when the close atmosphere of the compartment made her faint. He called the waiter, who brought some soda, and he put a teaspoonful of whisky in her glass. The girl then fainted, and in assisting her, his actions were open to misinterpretation by the guard. He swore that he had not been guilty of indecency. The lady would be the first to resent it, and she knew nothing of the present proceedings. With regard to the evidence of the newsagent, the girl did jump on Batka's knee and jump off again. She was a lively young lady, and as he had known her since she was 4 years old and was old enough to be her father, there was nothing suggestive in the circumstances. Batka didn't look upon the guard's threat as serious and didn't think he had reported the matter to the station master. Whittaker knew Batka stayed at Warner's when in Christchurch, and had the guard reported the occurrence, Batka thought the station master would have interviewed him, Batka, about it. Accused acknowledged to Sergeant Johnston that he had said to the guard, "We're all human," but meant that the guard was human to place such a deplorable construction on Batka's action in the birdcage. Sergeant Johnson: "What is the lady's name?" Mr. Donnelly strenuously objected to the question. Hargreaves, JP: "It seems peculiar that the lady has not been called." Mr. Donnelly: "The prosecution doesn't suggest she is a prostitute." Sergeant Johnston: "Why do you not call the lady?" Batka. She is a respectable lady and has no knowledge of this charge. To avoid misconstruction on the motives of accused, Mr. Donnelly suggested that he would give the name of the woman. Sergeant Johnston. What is the lady's name? Accused. Miss Wilson. She lives in Auckland with her family. What is her Christian name? I do not know. Are you separated from your wife? Yes. What was the reason? An accident. It was a domestic arrangement. Guard Bernardsoni, recalled, swore positively to what had taken place. The bench retired and, returning in 12 minutes, found the case against Batka proved and fined him £10 and costs. It was subsequently discovered that the bench had no power to impose a fine, and after considerable argument with counsel, who claimed that previous good character didn't justify stigma of imprisonment, the bench convicted Batka and discharged him. The Batka indecency case had its sequel in another court, when his wife sued him for divorce on the grounds of misconduct. And I am the perfectly proper Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
The latest listings from Heritage New Zealand include the fascinating tale of a castle which has seen better years, and an old sod cottage that's attracting visitors interested in its past. This report from Alison Breeze.
We've been busy at Heritage New Zealand Poiritonga this month with many new listings and upgrades for the Otago Southland region. This month I'll focus on two of our latest listings from Heritage New Zealand, which include the fascinating tale of wreck and ruin of a castle overrun by rabbits and an old sod cottage that is now a well-loved tourist attraction. The Earnscleugh Station Homestead. Vacant for some years, Earnscleugh Station Homestead suffered from rotting carpet, black mould, collapsed ceilings and a leaking roof until the property was purchased by Ryan Sanders and Marco Creamers in 2022. The couple have undertaken extensive renovations to restore the original planned homestead. The property's original character has been restored, but why was the homestead never completed? Earnscleugh Station Homestead is situated on the west bank of the Clutha River between Clyde and Alexandra. It is an important South Island pastoral station, and early leaseholders A.C. Strode and William Fraser were prominent civic leaders during a time in which Otago was New Zealand's most significant province. Fraser, unfortunately, is infamous for liberating the first rabbits in Otago, which was a much regretted initiative. The station's battle against the evil of the rabbits shaped its early economy, and rabbiting became a full-time job, with freelancers selling pelts and carcasses to offset costs. The station's pastures were decimated, a stark reminder of the environmental toll rabbits exacted on central Otago. The homestead, coach house and stables were built in 1919, designed by Edmund Anscombe for Stevens Spain, who purchased the leasehold for the rabbit-infested run in 1902. Born in a tent during the 1862 gold rush, Spain was a butcher and a baker from Alexandra. Initially, Spain's principal source of income came from rabbits, and he used the money to stock the run with sheep. Spain contained the rabbit problem by first shooting and then canning rabbits for the export market. He made money out of the skins and opened a canning factory in Alexandra with over 90 workers processing 15,000 rabbits per day at its peak. As well as a successful canning business, Spain was actively involved in many local boards and civic affairs. Flush with wartime profits, the homestead is an imposingly fronted building of eccentric design and measures just a room and a half wide with open balconies. It consisted of 21 rooms, 3 bathrooms, 3 storerooms and 2 sun balconies with grounds, including a sweeping tree-lined drive, which were laid out by one of the country's most influential landscape gardeners, Alfred Buxton. This display of conspicuous consumption earned the homestead the name Spain's Folly. Unfortunately, Spain became caught up in the post-war collapse, and his poor financial decisions meant he was unable to complete the building. Spain's rabbit factory closed in 1924, and the Great Depression later compounded Spain's financial woes, with rabbits surging at Earnscleugh once again. Spain died in 1940 and the Earnscleugh homestead was passed to his 2 sons and his son-in-law. The building of a brick wall right through the centre led to decades of rumours of a bitter family feud. Granddaughter Bridget Denniston dismissed the feud. The homestead was split into 2 to accommodate the 2 families' privacy rather than any infighting. The homestead has passed through a string of owners since 1948, and the property was developed with orchards and agriculture, and further subdivided, but the homestead remained unfinished. Today, the homestead, or castle as it's now known, and the refurbished coach house operate as boutique luxury accommodation, finally completing what was Spain's dream home. Earnscleugh Station Homestead is list number 7405 and is a Category 1 historic place. Sod Cottage. Constructed by settler Hugh Murray for John McIntosh, this building at Lovell's Flat originally is thought to have functioned as an accommodation and store and a stopping place for gold prospectors. The name of Old Sod Cottage should more properly be called Old Cob Cottage, as the building is actually made of cob, not sods. Cob comes from subsoil and can be shaped and used in various forms. Farmers would dig up the cob and spread it in their cow yard. The cows would trample it, while the farmer mixed in straw, tussock and a bit of manure from the animals, and the resulting mixture could be shaped into blocks for building use. These early construction techniques demonstrate the adaptation the early settlers undertook with the construction of their homes and buildings, with the resources immediately available to them with little funds. Originally, John McIntosh used the building as a dwelling and a store, servicing the wagons and gold miners making their way south into central Otago. After McIntosh moved on, Mr McKinnon operated the store, and the cottage later functioned as a bakehouse with loft quarters for workers. In the 20th century, the cottage provided temporary accommodation for settlers constructing homes in the district, and later as an overnight stop for itinerant labourers, rabbiters, traders and swaggers, and eventually served as a gardener's residence. The South Otago Historical Society took on its conservation from owners, the Clark family, in 1969. The cottage had windows and frames smashed, and cattle and sheep had been roaming in and out. The Society, with the Clarks' permission, undertook extensive restoration work in 1969-70, but the bones of the cottage remain unchanged, as does the location. Today, the building is still managed by the Society as a tourist attraction. In 2025, plasterer Mike Jackson undertook an $88,000 restoration of the cottage's walls and floor in traditional lime plaster, which should help conserve its structure for many years to come. This building not only represents New Zealand's early colonial history, but is an excellent example of early settler buildings for which few intact examples exist today. The Sod Cottage and its site have become an iconic feature in the landscape, known to tourists and locals as a notable landmark. Sod Cottage was nominated by the South Otago Historical Society to be included on the Rārangi Kōrero Heritage New Zealand list. These stories are brought to you by Alison Breeze, reporting for Heritage Matters.
This programme will be repeated on Sunday, June the 7th at 7 p.m, on Thursday the 18th of June at 1 p.m, and on Sunday the 21st of June at 7 p.m. This programme has been generously sponsored by the Southern Heritage Trust. The Trust works to protect the city's heritage, particularly its fine old buildings and all the things that make Dunedin New Zealand's heritage capital. The Trust welcomes new members. It can be contacted at southernheritage.org.nz. That's southernheritage, all one word, .org.nz.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.